Chapter 6. Consolidation. With a shed and a small piece of land surrounding it, the oratory of St. Francis de Sales had now, Don Bosco considered, permanent quarters. The lease gave him fixity of tenure. It was a dilapidated shed, of course, and not very large, but it sufficed. On Easter Sunday, the 12th of April, 1846, with the Archbishop's permission, Don Bosco blessed the shed, now transformed into a chapel, and thus, after 18 months of wandering, the oratory settled down to its regular routine. It has developed very considerably since then, but it has never left that site in Valdocco, spreading from there to the four corners of the earth. Although his oratory now had its permanent quarters, Don Bosco never for a moment imagined that his difficulties were over. He thought, probably, that they were just beginning in real earnest, as indeed they were. During the whole period of some 20 months, while he had been harassed to find quarters for his undertaking, he earned his living as chaplain at the refuge. It was no sinecure, but by immense efforts he managed to combine this work with what he was doing for the youth of Turin. Nor did that exhaust his activities. There were his evening classes. He began them in his room at the refuge and continued them in the other places to which he was obliged to move the oratory. He selected promising boys and gave them lessons in Italian, French, and arithmetic, so that they could become pupil teachers under him, and one or two friends in the town came to lend a hand. Suitable books were lacking. He was unable, for example, to discover a Bible history that filled the conditions which he had in mind. Above all, it had to be simple and easy to read. He wrote one himself, which is still to be found in use in some Italian schools. Later on, he wrote other school books, an introduction to the metric system, for instance, in preparation for its adoption in Piedmont on the 1st of January 1850. There was also his manual for youth, containing the prayers and instructions, hymns and the rest, for use by his boys in chapel. He still visited the prisons. He helped at the Cotelengo Institute, and to this the constant visits that he received and paid, people of all sorts were continually calling for his help, and the begging journeys that he undertook to provide the necessities for his boys, the special sermons that he preached, the mere physical energy that he expended at recreation at his oratory, and it will be seen that even the strongest constitution would have been hard put to stand the strain. All this work by day obliged him to do his writing by night, and it was not long before his features betrayed the evident strain under which he was living. The Marchesa di Barolo made this an excuse to remonstrate with him for overtaxing his strength, though, if the truth be told, the fact of the matter was that she could not suffer one who was working under her orders in her establishment to be concerned with anything else. She could not complain of the quality of his work, and was obliged to acknowledge that he carried it out to perfection. But she was afraid, she told him, that one day it would suffer, and in the circumstances must request him, after careful consideration, to inform her whether he would give up the oratory or his position at her refuge. Don Bosco had no hesitation in making his choice on the spot. With the means at her disposal, chaplains would not be hard to come by, whereas the oratory was work that no one seemed willing to do save he. My whole life, he concluded, is bound up with the care of these lads, and nothing or nobody shall turn me aside from the path which God has clearly shown me. The Marchesa's reply not entirely unexpected, was to inform him that he had 3 months in which to give up his post and to find other living quarters. Thus, having signed a lease for Pinardi's shed and the piece of land adjoining it, Don Bosco found himself in the position of being shortly without any income and with no roof over his head. With this new anxiety, he carried on his work until at the beginning of July, after a grueling Sunday at the oratory, he fainted on returning to his room. He was found to be suffering from pneumonia and was soon at death's door. He received viaticum and was anointed. Proof of his reputation and the affection in which he was held by his boys of the oratory was shown by the consternation caused by the news of his illness and the fervent prayers offered for his recovery. He turned the corner and a fortnight later was able to return to Becky to convalesce, while Don Borel and 1 or 2 friends carried on the oratory as best they could in his absence. For 3 months they took his place and discovered, if they did not know it before, that the festive oratory, as Don Bosco's Sunday meetings were called, was not a task that absorbed one's energy only on one day of the week alone, though even that by itself was no light undertaking. Patience, affection for these youths, and self-sacrifice were all needed in coping with the crowd of 400 of them who came on the Sunday morning and only left after nightfall. Some were in rags, some perhaps were foul-mouthed. All probably were given to moments of indiscipline, and at their games the noise they generated was not always easy to bear. They had to be met with a smile and treated with affection. Their faults were to be foreseen and prevented rather than corrected. Above all, those who were directing the oratory had to enter into all the activities, heart and soul, whether it was a game or a catechism lesson. Then, during the week, they might have to walk miles in the Turin streets, seeking here a job for some youth of work, there an alms to enable the work to continue, and to be prepared to receive as the sole reward of their labours the criticism or misunderstanding of their actions on the part of the bien-pensants of the city, or eyebrows raised and condescension of colleagues in the clergy. It says much for Don Bosco's faithful friends, Don Borel especially, that they bore all this for well nigh 4 months. Medical opinion prescribed a longer convalescence for Don Bosco than 4 months, but that period was as long as he was willing to take. He was anxious to be back with his boys. His illness had left its mark on him, and in addition, for the rest of his life, he suffered from varicose veins. Yet he seemed hardly ever to be off his feet, and, until his last illness, never took a real holiday, and worked at a pressure that would have killed most men in a short time. He was returning to Turin without a roof or settled income. He managed, however, to solve the first difficulty by renting a flat in a house belonging to Pinardi, adjacent to his converted shed at Valdocco. The 4 rooms on the first floor of the somewhat dilapidated and uninviting house became his home, and because the reputation of the place was more than a trifle unsavoury, he managed to persuade his mother to accompany him, to safeguard his character. That she consented was some measure of her affection for him and her belief in the work which he was doing, for it meant uprooting her from her tranquil life in the country at a time she was no longer young, to the noise of the town and the daily cares arising from 400 youths taken in charge by Don Bosco. Before setting out, she sold some of her treasured possessions, including her wedding dress, to get together a little money to provide food and necessities for the first few weeks. and so the pair set out on the 3rd of November 1846 to walk to Turin, a 6-hour journey, carrying their bundles containing linen, kitchen utensils, and a few books. Slowly they made their way into the town, exhausted after their sustained effort for upwards of 20 miles, an old woman and her convalescent son. It was dark by the time they reached Valdocco. Settling in took a little time, and in a day or two Don Bosco was ready to take up his work where a few months before he had left it off. The first matter to engage his attention was the evening classes. These he developed considerably, and, as before, used the brightest of his boys as pupil teachers for the others. Attendance at the festive oratory grew rapidly. It was now in the region of 600 or 700, and space was once again Don Bosco's problem. He managed to obtain other rooms at the house as tenants left, but there came a point when, for the time, no more were available, and the only thing to do was to found another oratory. In fact, 2 more were founded within 2 years. It might be supposed that with upwards of 600 youths attending his oratory, his evening classes well organized, so well organized indeed that an inspection by the civil authorities produced tangible evidence of their satisfaction in the shape of a grant of £12 a year, and all his other works to occupy his times and energies, it would be prudent, at least for him, to consolidate his position, to accept no new undertaking, but to continue with the methods that he evolved for himself in the light of his growing experience. That was not Don Bosco's way. Prudence, in that restricted sense at least, had no place in his vocabulary. Overnight, for instance, he improved a boarding establishment after meeting half a dozen young roughs not far from his house. They were inclined to be hostile, but Don Bosco, always quick-witted, offered them a drink at a nearby tavern, and in conversation discovered they had nowhere to sleep. "You'd better come with me," was his immediate reaction. That night he bedded them down in the attic, lending them blankets. Next morning they had gone, taking the bedclothes with them. In no wise discouraged, shortly afterwards he brought home with him a young mason's apprentice whom he had discovered wet through in the pouring rain. The lad was without money or lodging and out of work. Margaret Bosco made him some soup and dried him by her fire, and that night she gave him a bed in her kitchen. Before he fell asleep, she said a word or two of encouragement to him, telling him of the goodness of God, and so inaugurating the custom that since then has prevailed in all Don Bosco's houses of a brief good night talk every evening after prayers. Other boys were not long in joining that first boarder. Don Bosco was obliged to rent more rooms, and found himself at last in almost complete possession of the house. Obviously, the time had come to buy it. Pinardi wanted upwards of £3,000 for it. Don Bosco, with a shrewd idea of its actual value, offered 1,200. Agreement was reached at 1,500, with payment of the whole sum in cash in a fortnight's time. Of course, Don Bosco had not a penny towards it, but the sum was found in less than a week. Don Cafasso was instrumental in bringing £500, the gift of the Contessa Riccardi, and a Rosminian provided 1,000, which he invested in the project on behalf of a friend. On the 19th of February 1851, Pinardi's house became Don Bosco's. He had no difficulty in filling it. Soon he had 30 apprentices lodging there. He was able to find work for them and provide them with food and instruction. There was no institution, forbidding an aspect and cramping to its inmates. It was a family life that Don Bosco offered these lads, and though, of course, like all other families, it had its rules, they were conceived in a spirit of gentleness, with no trace of repression about them. Life was supremely simple, but his genius made it happy. Then, too, he and his mother shared with the boys, and gave it that familiar Silesian stamp that Don Bosco always insisted should mark his houses, pointing to those early years, 1851 to 1856, as the time when it was realized to the full. After Mass, betimes with a bread roll in their pockets, they set off for their work, returning at midday for their principal meal, often a thick soup or polenta cooked by Don Bosco. With his apron tied over his cassock, he served them with his own hands. There was no refectory. They ate where they could, in the yard before the house, or in one or other of the rooms, sitting on the stairs. For their second course, he gave a full halfpenny to each boy to buy something on his way back to work. Margaret Bosco looked after their clothes and did the huge weekly wash for the large family. Once or twice her patience wore thin when, for instance, she found her newly laundered sheets torn down by some thoughtless youth, or her precious bed of seasonings and salads trampled past repairing. But still, at 65, she remained her son's mainstay, as she had done in his school days or during his seminary course. In the evening, after supper and recreation, came night prayers, not in the chapel, to encourage the boys to form the habit of praying elsewhere than in church, and a few words of exhortation, followed by bed. Don Bosco was now in charge of two distinct works. One had grown out of the other: his festive oratory on Sundays, and his boarding establishment for some 30 apprentices, whom he sought thus to protect from the dangers of living in the town, far from their families, or with parents who took care of them. The festive oratory must not be forgotten in the course of the following narrative. It continued to take place with increasing numbers, and in a few years was to be found in other places than Turin. But from this period dates the development of the other side of Don Bosco's work. Like all that he did, it grew in a consequence of a particular need at a particular moment. First, however, he was obliged to build. For 5 years, the chapel in the improvised hut had done duty for his growing oratory. It had always been too small for its purpose. By 1851, it was becoming impossible to use it. On the 21st of July in that year, therefore, the first stone of a new church of St. Francis de Sales was laid, and Don Bosco set about gathering together the money needed to pay for the building. He begged from all and sundry, not omitting the royal family. He organized a great lottery, the first of several that he ran to provide for his ever-increasing needs. Somehow or other, he collected the money, and in less than a year, the church was opened, free of debt. The church completed, he decided to erect by the side of Pinardi's house one more suited to his purpose. In July 1852, work was put in hand and pushed forward at a rapid rate. So rapidly indeed that with poor materials and shoddy workmanship on the part of the builder, the newly roofed house collapsed during a long, heavy storm at the beginning of November. Undaunted, Don Bosco began again in the following spring, and by October was in possession of a house with room for 65 boys. In 1856, he was building again. Pinardi's old house standing between his new church and house, was demolished and replaced by a wing added to the latter. Don Bosco was working for the youth of Turin, those who, long before they were grown up, were obliged to earn their bread, those who had no hope of education or even, in many cases, religious instruction, who had to face the world in an early age before they were ready to withstand its dangers. He protected them as far as he could against the evils that they encountered. For some, he provided the family life that otherwise would not have been theirs. For all, he gave that religious instruction and training that was necessary for them if they were to persevere in after years. He had taken in the apprentices to preserve them from the dangers of unsuitable lodgings and companions. He took in also other boys who frequented his festive oratory and who were not of the stamp of masons, bricklayers, or manual craftsmen, but gave promise of being able to benefit from a liberal education. These he sent to school every day in the town. With both categories, he felt anxiety lest the contact with the wickedness of the world at an early age should harm them. It was his intention that both apprentices and students should receive their education, whether professional or liberal, within the walls of his own establishment. The change was accomplished gradually. In 1853, to provide for the needs of his growing community, Don Bosco had opened a tailor's and a shoemaker's shop in a corridor of the old Pinardi house. Later on, he started carpenters' and bookbinders' shops, to which was joined, a little later, a small printing press. Other crafts were added until training could be given in practically every manual trade that was called for. Don Bosco's technical schools quickly achieved a reputation which they have preserved and indeed enhanced in our own time. The schoolboys were soon being cared for in the same way. As the first few passed out from the top class of the local grammar school, they were taken by Don Bosco to become masters in charge of the lowest classes at the oratory in Valdocco. And so, as the years went by, he soon had a teaching staff familiar with the work and the kind of material with which they had to deal, for they themselves had risen from very similar circumstances to those of their young charges. By October 1856, all Don Bosco's 150 boarders were being taught as well as housed in the establishment that they had grown out of the catechism lessons and recreative meetings that took place originally in the quadrangle of the convito, and then haphazardly all over the town wherever they could find premises of some sort. His clerical colleagues had thought him mad when he had dreamt of an established premises, a church, helpers, and a properly organized undertaking. He had even spoken of a religious congregation to run it all. By 1856, most were bound to acknowledge that his dreams seemed to have a curious knack of coming true. The material part had certainly been fulfilled, and by this date his helpers were already known as Salesians. The congregation existed in embryo. His mother, in that year of 1856, had every reason to be proud of her son. She had seen the work grow from its makeshift premises in the shed and 4 rooms in Pinardi's house, until now he was presiding over an establishment of some size. Her share in all this might well appear to be small. On the contrary, it was considerable, to say nothing of the domestic arrangements which had fallen to her care, and they formed by no means the least important side of a house such as this was. Her encouragement had never been lacking, even when things seemed at their most difficult. She shared her son's enthusiasm and lent her aid in all the ways she knew to further their accomplishment. At 67, by modern standards, she would not be accounted old, and her tough Piedmontese peasant contribution shook off many ailments that would have proved serious to others less endowed. But towards the end of 1856 she fell ill. Pneumonia was diagnosed, and she received the last sacraments from the hands of Don Borel. Her son John was at her bedside, and Joseph, his brother, also praying for a miracle, that her life should be spared, but it was not to be, and she died in the early morning of the 3rd of November. It was a grievous loss for both sons, to John particularly, for she had been a mother not only to him, but to all those in his care. But a man cannot cling to his mother all his life, and perhaps he felt that this was true of his work also. She had left it at this particular junction, and in future it would have to do without her care. Was it perhaps that the work had grown up and reached adult stature, must fend for itself to some extent, without a mother's care? That was small consolation in his loss, but in fact at the end of that year, as we have seen, it certainly looked as if it were true. At 5 that morning, Don Bosco set out for Turin's great Marian sanctuary, La Consolata. There, at his mother's favourite church, he said Mass for her soul. Before returning to the oratory, he had laid his work at Our Lady's feet, not indeed for the first time, but on this occasion with special emphasis. His whole undertaking had lost his mother's help, given ungrudgingly in her generosity and self-sacrifice. More than ever now he felt that he needed his heavenly mother's help and guidance.